Brittany Delaney is a spoken word artist and arts educator born and raised in Minnesota. She's been performing on the scene for 18 years after getting her start in slam poetry. Brittany has participated in spoken word groups such as the Minnesota Spoken Word Association, Quest for the Voice, Brave New Voices on HBO, Teens Rock the Mic, and various slam organizations. She's facilitated poetry workshops in university-based establishments across the country and is currently contracting as a curriculum consultant for various school districts across the United States. She continues doing residencies, diversity training, and tours. Her focus is promoting literacy, inclusion, and safe space learning environments through culturally responsive and responsible curriculum and practices. And as she mentioned, she is also the new executive director of Black Table Arts. There's so much more that I could say about both Dr. John Wright and Brittany Delaney, but I'm going to just turn it over to them and let them speak for themselves. And again, welcome everyone.
Thank you, Carolyn. Hello, Dr. Wright.
Hello, Brittany.
It is so amazing to have you here in this space.
Well, let me say, while Brittany is trying to get her mic situation straight, how grateful I am to be involved in an enterprise like this. I want to recognize Carolyn Holbrook's years and years and years of supporting the arts in our community. Locally here, she has worked on so many levels and so many different organizations over these many years that she deserves all the accolades we can offer her. And for organizations, again, like Black Table Arts and Embracing Our Roots, groups of young people in particular, I'm very, very happy to be involved here to share whatever I can about the course of my experiences and my life and my upbringing in this community.
Thank you so much for your kind words.
When it wasn't until about into high school that I first learned the Moral Hall Takeover at the University of Minnesota. And I want to give other people a chance to sort of get an intro to what that actually is. And so in your words, Dr. Wright, can you give a brief explanation of the Moral Hall Takeover?
The Moral Hall Takeover was a student direct action protest that had its origins in the national response to the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King in April of 1968. This audience, most of you are too young, of course, to remember this live, but I was an undergraduate student at the university during the 1960s. I started in, my freshman year was in 1963, so I was an undergraduate from 1963 through 1968, and then stayed on in graduate school thereafter. But those years were tumultuous years in American life. They were signaled on the one hand, but to be early in the decade, 1963, in fact, right before the fall of my freshman year, Dr. King delivered the famous "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington in front of the national monuments in the nation's capital. But that fall of 1963 was also the fall of the assassination of John Kennedy. And it began a series of assassinations and public disturbances, rebellions, riots, and so on that spread throughout that decade. The civil rights movement was intense during those years, but it was increasingly being challenged by the rise of Black Power, the Black Power movement, in many cases being led by students who had been disciples of or apostles of Dr. Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that played such a key role in mounting the civil rights agenda. But the middle of the 1960s, while we had tremendous national successes like the passing of the Civil Rights Acts in 1964 and 1965, that presumably would restore the citizenship rights that Black people had been denied since the end of the Reconstruction years and the rise of the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court sanctioned Jim Crow system. But those gains, the gains of the civil rights laws of the mid-60s, soon found themselves facing tremendous obstacles. And Dr. King and the members of the SCLC had increasingly to change their approach, change their strategy. And we had a student organization at the University of Minnesota that was originally called the Students for Racial Progress. The acronym was STRAP that we had used again in the mid-60s. And it was a student group that had supported the freedom rides in the South, that tried to establish links with Black student organizations around the country, and pursued ties again with the local communities here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. And those community ties were very, very important. We had dynamic local organizations like the Way Community Center on the north side of Minneapolis on Plymouth Avenue that was led by Syl Davis and Mahmoud El Khati and so many others. And in St. Paul, the Inner City Youth League, Bobby Hickman, and again, a long list of supporters there. We as students had strong ties to those groups. In 1967, we brought Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to the University of Minnesota campus. He gave an address on the mall in St. Paul to a crowd of over 4,000. And it was an electric moment for us as students then. Dr. King had come to Minnesota after having spent several weeks living in Southside Chicago in tenements and in the slum sections of Southside Chicago. And he was working then on his very last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. Dr. King's address here in Minnesota touched on many of the points that had become issues of national debates within the freedom struggle by the mid and late 1960s, including, again, the rise of Black Power as a challenge to the civil rights movement and its agenda. And Dr. King was very concerned that, again, young disciples of his, leaders like Stokely Carmichael, who'd been part of this of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, H. Rap Brown, also linked to SNCC, so forth, become leaders in the move towards what would become Black Power. And their actions, in part, were a response to the increasing failures and defeats that the civil rights agenda faced as it moved from trying to deal with the vestiges of legal segregation, of de jure segregation in the Old South, to dealing with the entrenched problems of housing and employment discrimination and economic exploitation in the urban North. And it was in that context, again, that we brought Dr. King here to address those issues. Almost a year to the date, following his appearance here in April of 1967, he was assassinated on April 4th of 1968. And over that weekend, the nation blew up, essentially. There were massive urban rebellions in more than 100 cities across the country. Urban centers were in flames, far beyond the ability of local police forces to contain or control or delimit. The National Guard and the US Army had to be called out. Dr. King was assassinated on a Friday evening, and all these upheavals and rebellions took place over the course of that weekend. Our student group met the following Monday and tried to figure out what we could do that would both honor Dr. King and his legacy of principled moral leadership on the one hand, and contribute to constructive change here at the university and in the community at large. And in that context, the group asked me, I was on our executive committee at the time, they asked me to draft a response, in which context I formulated the 7 demands that we submitted early that week to the presidency, the university administration presidency of Malcolm Moose. And that began the process that would lead finally to the Moral Hall takeover 8 months later, because the university did what universities are prone to do. They set up a task force to study the problem. And this task force meandered along month after month after month with little visible progress, until, again, some 8 months later, after a series of meetings that representatives of our group leadership had with the administration, made it very clear that the progress was simply unsatisfactory. And so in January of 1969, January 14th, I believe to be correct, we, after another meeting with the administration officials, decided that we would take direct nonviolent action and occupy the administration building, Morrill Hall of the university, to force a coherent and acceptable response to those original 7 demands. That was the Morrill Hall takeover. And that evening on the CBS News, Walter Cronkite announced that Black students at the University of Minnesota had occupied the administration building. So that is a backdrop, part of the backdrop to the Morrill Hall takeover of 1969.
And you hit on so many points in there around organization that I definitely want to delve into, especially right now in the current state in Minnesota. I think we are always sort of exploring what it looks like to come together with collective voice. So first, would you mind sort of explaining what the environment was like at the University of Minnesota in 1969 that led to this takeover?
Well, the environment, the University of Minnesota was and is one of the largest public urban campuses in this country. But the Black presence at the University of Minnesota had always been minimal and marginal. Again, I'm someone who had family forebears who had been students at the University of Minnesota. My father and my aunt were students at the university in the mid-1930s, had entered as freshmen in 1934 during the height of the Great Depression, and at a time when the then administration of President Lotus Kaufman was still practicing Jim Crow policies on the university, restricting Black students from living in the dormitories, constraining the athletic careers of Black Gopher varsity athletes, condoning the denial of entry of Black students to fraternities and sororities and so forth on campus. The very first Black student organization, which was called the Council of Negro Students, was created in that context in 1936 and 1937. My aunt, Martha Wright, became the president of the Council of Negro Students. And she was also the Basilius, the head of the AKAs, the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, Black female sorority on campus at the time. They first confronted the university administration then about the multiple problems and conflicts on the university campus. So part of what had happened was in the course of the decades, a generation, more than a generation had passed, and there had been comparatively little progress at the University of Minnesota. There were there weren't many more Black students at the University of Minnesota when I entered as a freshman in 1963 than there were when my father and aunt were there in the mid-1930s. And it was in part because historically Black parents, particularly because of the university's history of Jim Crow policies, of marginalization and so forth, Black parents historically had preferred to send their children to the historically Black colleges and universities of the South, rather than to endure the circumstances at the university. So there was much to be done. And of course, we came on campus in the 1960s during the crest of the civil rights and emerging Black power movements, which helped give us a community stronghold and a base and the leadership and connection with community elders that was so crucial to our efforts on campus.
And coming back to just sort of our current situation around building collective voice, especially in younger movements, can you talk about the process that was sort of established for you all to decide who leadership was in the Morrill Hall takeover and how it is that you came to the demands?
Well, one of the things that we devoted ourselves to during those years was trying to develop a genuine historical consciousness, awareness of African American history and the history and the broader history of this country and of the world. The 1960s was also a decade in which there was a tremendous global upheaval taking place. And the old colonial European empires in Asia, Africa, and Latin America were crumbling or had already crumbled, and newly independent nations were emerging in Africa, in the Caribbean, and so forth. And this helped give us a global perspective in this regard, and again, an impetus to begin studying what we subsequently would come to call the African diaspora, the Black diaspora. And we had, again, a groups then, since their numbers were much smaller than today, of students who were from various parts of the Caribbean and from East and West and Southern Africa on campus. And the Black Power movement gave us a conceptual framework for thinking about our ties to these other people of African origin, again, who had been scattered across the globe in the course of the last several centuries in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade. We studied intensively. We had reading groups because there were no Black studies programs and majors and so forth on campus, very few courses. We had to do much of this on our own or with the leadership from community groups. And our ties to the Way Center in North Minneapolis and the Inner City Youth League were crucial in that regard. Mahmoud El-Khati at the Way became the intellectual father, again, of a whole generation of young Black folks who gleaned from his classes and from those of other learned community elders who were not formally trained academics, but who had immersed themselves in African American and African history. We learned from them perspectives that we would not otherwise have had at our disposal.
And just for people listening in, the Way, so just a little bit of like, kind of Minnesota history and connecting the dots. The Way was torn down and was replaced with the 4th Precinct, which was shut down in the light of the Jamar Clark death and the uprising that happened as a response to that. So just sort of, brushing into how that connects to what's going on today. And Dr. Wright, I know one of the conversations that we're constantly having is how it is that we can connect youth with our elders. And so can you talk about how the elders were able to establish that connection with younger people at the time in a way that was respectful to the work and helped push it forward?
Well, community agencies, whether they were settlement houses or youth, government-sponsored youth organizations, whatever, have always been crucial to African American life and community development and education, particularly where our formal schools, whether they were K-12 schools or the schools of higher education, failed to perform those functions. Historically, places like the Phyllis Wheatley House in Minneapolis on the north side, and the Hallie Q. Brown Center in St. Paul were also places of alternative education, learning, study, where we could begin to again develop a sense of the transgenerational nature of the freedom struggle and of the need for one generation to pass on to the next. The lessons learned, both the assets and liabilities of different kinds of strategies and alliances, all those things came out of the process again of study, and again in a community linked context.
And can you talk about how students prepared for what was to come with the University of Minnesota? Because I imagine at the time there had to be some dangers associated with demonstrating in this sort of way, especially in a university that at the time was halfway about even admitting Black students. How did you all prepare for this? What was the backlash?
Well, because there's another element of the era that I haven't alluded to so far. Of course, this was taking place during the context of the Vietnam War. Mm. And in the case of what was then, of course, a military draft system. And all young men of military age were subject to the draft. And the presence of the military draft and the politics of the Vietnam War and the circumstances of third world countries seeking independence and national autonomy were very much impressed on us. And we increasingly became in part politicized by studying and trying to understand the context of the Vietnam War and of national liberation movements scattered around the globe. So on campus, the campuses in that regard were much more politicized than is the case today, in part because, again, of the war and the military draft. And so there was an active, alongside our Black student organization, there was a very widely developed anti-war and war education effort going on campus. And that involved a wide variety of student groups.
And did that at all influence how you all came to just, creating the demands in that process? And would you mind just sort of building on how you all decided on the 7?
Well, again, I had been studying, and most of us have been aware of some of the demands that had been submitted to the college campus administrations by Black student groups elsewhere in this country. And we might want to remember in this regard that many of those initial demands took place on historically Black college university campuses. Black students at Howard University, for instance, played a key role. And in those contexts, we had a history again of these Black higher education institutions where you had traditionally largely white, in some cases, church missionary administrations that had not paid attention to close attention or were responsive to the underlying social and cultural and educational and spiritual needs of their Black student clienteles. It's a step backwards in time, but some of those issues were faced on Black college campuses back in the 1920s and 1930s during the Black Renaissance era, which was when the first Black student rebellions against college administrations took place. So there was a history there that some of us were aware of in terms of our ties to those Black college campuses from earlier decades.
And so what I hear at the base of that is that collective education played a huge role in how it was that Black people organized. And I know that that's something just sort of in current day Minnesota that tends to struggle. And I know that that's a larger conversation around the schools and our educational system and sort of the issues that we have there, the disparities that we're currently facing. One of the things that you mentioned was that the Sisters of the Alpha Kappa Alpha
AKA,
yes, AKAs had gone to the university prior to. Can you talk a little more about the role of Black women in the movement at the time? Because one of the things that I have come up against is that it's a lot of stories are just sort of erased at those intersections. And one of the beautiful things that we have here is that you were present for it. Can you talk about that?
Black women throughout the history of the freedom struggle in this country, Black women have played central roles as organizers, as leaders, as supporters, as visionaries. And that's a history that takes us back again to the late 18th century and early 19th century during the abolitionist era. And too often, again, our histories have obscured the central roles that Black women played. Anyone who has studied the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s understands the role, particularly with Black churches in which the congregations, in many cases, had majority Black female populations, and whom the church hierarchies oftentimes were led by Black women, understand the crucial role that Black women played as organizers and leaders in that context. That was the same thing in terms of our student realities here on campus. There were 3 primary leaders in the Afro-American Action Committee that we formed again in 1967. And Rosemary Freeman Massey and Anna Stanley were 2 of those 3 central leaders. And I think it's also important to say that those leaders, along with Horace Huntley, third, were all from other parts of the country and had come to Minnesota for an education, or in the case of Rosemary Freedom, in part a step away from her background in deep South Mississippi, where she'd been engaged in the freedom struggle there, or in Horace Huntley's case again, who had been in the military and confronted the issues of race and racial conflict in the military. Anna Stanley had come from Philadelphia. They brought some outside regional perspectives into our organization that were very, very valuable.
That's awesome. And then, one of the things that I'm always interested in is sort of the things that we don't always get a chance to read about in books. And that's sort of the internal process and thinking. I'm a mother. I have, a 7-year-old son and an 8-year-old daughter. And one of the conversations I'm always having, especially around my son, is that, as a Black boy, there's always sort of this conversation about him having to be this or about him having to mobilize around his pain, rather than just being able to have the experience. And so I guess I'm wondering, how did you sort of come to this space of activism at the University of Minnesota? And, you know, was that the plan going into it? Was this always sort of just underneath everything and activism was a part of your world, or was this something that was awakened in college?
Well, I think for many of us, I mean, it's a lot of different variables operating there, because Black folks are not and have never been a monolith. We come from a variety of different regional backgrounds, social and class stratas, educational advantages or disadvantages, and so forth. We bring all these different perspectives, along with, again, our different religious outlooks and philosophical frameworks. All those differences were at play in terms of how we responded to the challenges of living and trying to learn on a campus then of more than 40,000 students, in which there were fewer than 100 African-American students at the time. So, in my case, again, I came from a family context that included, again, a previous generation of college graduates, and those who had been at the university decades earlier, and who came with high aspirations, but also with a family tradition of struggle. My grandfather, for whom I'm named, he and his wife, my grandmother, Fanny Hall Wright, had come to Minnesota following relatives who had migrated here from small towns in Kentucky during the Reconstruction years in the 1870s, and had to struggle in Minnesota, in what was still in many ways a frontier environment in the late 19th century and so forth, and had developed strong roles as community leaders and participants in terms of church affiliations. My grandfather was one of the earliest members of the oldest Black Baptist church in Minneapolis, Bethesda Baptist Church in the Elliott neighborhood. He became ultimately the head of the educational programs at Bethesda Baptist Church. He had gotten his own education in the Deep South in one of the freedmen schools, the Eckstein Norton Normal and Agricultural School in Kentucky. That background and his role here, again, as an organizer, as an ally with Frederick McGee, the turn of the century Black Minnesota lawyer who had helped develop the Niagara movement that led to the founding of the NAACP, and who had been also one of the leaders of the very first national Black civil rights organization, the NAAC, the National Afro-American Council, that had held its national convention here in 1902. So again, in that sense, I had a family history of involvement in those kind of enterprises that helped guide me. And others, again, came from different kinds of social and political and religious perspectives.
And I know, so for some people, I think after having that sort of experience, oftentimes they, leave the university and never look back. But you later came to work there, and after having such a notable role in the Moral Hall takeover, can you talk about how that came to be?
Well, I was. I have a somewhat unusual educational trajectory in that regard. And I was, as an undergraduate, in the Institute of Technology. My undergraduate major was electrical engineering.
Oof.
And I was the lone Black student in all of my classes throughout my years in the Institute of Technology. That also wasn't new in terms of the family history, because my Aunt Martha, who I mentioned earlier on, who was a brilliant mathematician and who was an unacknowledged valedictorian of North High, class of 1934, and who had skipped 2 grades, had come to the university in 1934 and had entered what was then called the School of Technology, and was the only Black student in the School of Technology in the 1930s, and one of only 5 or 6 women then. So there was a history that way, but these were somewhat isolating circumstances in many ways. And I needed, in terms of my own social and psychological personal development, ties with my Black peers. And most of them were in other colleges on campus. So our student organizations served as means, again, for fellowship, from camaraderie, for playtime, for sport, for partying, all those functions, as well as our political and social protest functions. And that was very, very critical at the time. Many of the Black students on campus during those years were in the general college, had been admitted to the general college, which had been created back during the Depression years as an open admissions college, kind of a predecessor for the community colleges that would come along later on. But that had been the primary doorway through which so many Black students had come to the university back then. But that kind of pattern persisted in the 1960s and early 1970s as well.
My goodness. And I know that currently at the University of Minnesota, there are still discussions just around Black life and disparities that exist on campus. Having come from both your experience and now from a space where you've worked through this system, how would you suggest that people organize, especially students right now, organize around addressing those things in the university?
Well, one of the things, again, I continue to teach or talk about, whatever, again, is the need for a historical perspective. That gives one some sense, both of the fact, again, that the struggle for freedom in this country is transgenerational. It is ongoing. It is never ending. And we have to think in terms of long distance running in that regard, in terms of the way in which we use our energies in life and pursue our goals. And today's context, the issues on our campuses have changed in some respects, in terms of public policy issues, but in other respects, we're still mired in a past from which we have not freed ourselves. And students on campus today, just a few years ago, several student groups on campus allied themselves together and basically is an echo of the Moral Hall takeover, tried to articulate the current issues on campus about the continuing marginalization of students of color, the unequal distribution of resources, the lack of professional opportunities, of study abroad, a whole array of concerns that persist in the present. And that requires, clearly a very conscious and careful awareness about how institutions like this university work. University of Minnesota, again, is a public land grant institution. It was founded in the wake of the Moral Hall Acts, whose origins go back to the Civil War era. And they were originally, those land grant universities and colleges were originally founded to open up education, formal higher education, to the members of the working classes and to the sons and daughters of toil, as the phrase went then, which included, again, slaves and the descendants of slaves. And the university has a mission, an original mission, that unfortunately, over the course of time, was undermined, subverted, so forth, by administrations, by faculty members, by student groups, and so forth, with an entirely different agenda allied with the forces of Jim Crow and white supremacy. And unfortunately, neither Jim Crow or white supremacy are dead yet.
And does the university carry a responsibility to its students to address the current concerns?
Absolutely. This is still a land grant university, and the demands of social justice and of the original mission still prevail. Young students today need to understand that in some ways, part of what has to be confronted is the erosion of the old social contract between the general public and higher education. When I started as a freshman at the university in 1963, the tuition was $95 a quarter.
Oh my.
Even when adjusted for inflation, it's a fraction of what tuition is today. It was possible, again, for us in those days to work during the summer and make enough money to pay our tuition and book expenses for the year. That has not been the case for a very, very long time because the American public in general has moved backward from the older compact with higher education that provided a much larger percentage of state revenues to support these institutions and to provide open access. That's a national issue, but locally here, it's an issue that today's students on campus, on this campus, university campus, and the outlying campuses around the state, as well as our MINSCU system, the junior college system, and so forth, need to be aware of and to confront as such.
I hear it. And so Black people in the Twin Cities have been through various traumas, both state responsible trauma by way of the police, brutality, COVID, and community responsible trauma with systems of oppression that are around us. Can you share your thoughts on what inspires you to keep going, particularly since 2020? What cluster of hope are you finding, particularly in Minnesota?
Right. Well, let me take a step back in terms of personal history again here. I was born into the Phillips neighborhood near Franklin, Chicago. I was an immediate post-World War II front end of the baby boom generation member. And I started school at the old Horace Greeley Elementary School. No longer exists. The site was long since plowed under, and now the Anderson Elementary School stands on that site. But I was born into the Phillips neighborhood and got my initial education in that context, in a very mixed neighborhood. Then the demography is different in some respects than from what it was back then. But even back then, it was still a very mixed neighborhood. Black folks, white folks, Native Americans, some Hispanics and Asians were all part of that neighborhood mix. And my early years, I had no particular animus towards the police or police force. In fact, my initial impressions of the police were very, very positive, because our next door neighbor was a family, the family of Walter Rhodes, who was one of the earliest Black Minneapolis police officers and the head of the forensic division at the police police headquarters, and he was a pillar of professional integrity, and a great pleasure to be around. So I had very, very positive attitudes towards the police just from the personal relationship with Walter Rhodes and his family. So it would take some time and a series of increasingly painful experiences with the police in Minneapolis and later in the suburbs for me to alter my attitudes towards police and policing. By the time I was a student at the University of Minnesota, I had already been subject for several years to the issues of what we now call driving while Black. That is, again, my family we had moved out of the Phillips neighborhood when I was about 7 years old. My grandparents had a farm in Robbinsdale that they had owned since the World War I era. And when my grandfather died back in 1954, we had moved out of one of the apartment buildings they owned in the Phillips neighborhood out to the farm, where we still had 20 acres of working farmland, and where the suburbs were just beginning to encroach. By the time I was 15 and got my driver's license, as soon as I began driving, I began to be stopped by the police for no apparent reason other than that I was a young Black man driving a car in a place where in their minds, I was not supposed to be. So I began to have to deal routinely with that kind of police intrusion into my personal space and prerogatives. At the university, those years in the 1960s, again, which involved highly politicized campuses across the country, here and as elsewhere, were also years of increasing police surveillance, both local and national. The FBI put Black student organizations like our Afro-American Action Committee under surveillance as potential sources of insurrection and a variety of other radical ills. And so many of us were being surveilled by the Minneapolis police. And I and other members of AAAC were routinely being stopped by the police, hauled down to the police headquarters in downtown Minneapolis on spurious charges. In that context, all of those things again helped or forced me to think differently about the nature of policing, the responsibilities of the police, and the needs for police reform.
And I know that we could unpack that all day long, but I want to make sure that I get a chance to ask you about the Givens collection. You've just had such an expansive career. I sat all day sort of wondering, like, which questions will I have time to get answered? So would you mind just talking about the Givens collection, the art acquisition?
Be glad to, Brittany. And I just have to give a little backstory on this also.
Yes, please.
I didn't fully answer your question about my change from electrical engineering undergraduate background to a graduate focus on African American and African studies. That for me took place in part in the context of the Vietnam War, the draft, my own collisions with the draft, so on. And ultimately, after my battle with the draft was over, my decision to move away from the physical sciences and the number of jobs that I had taken during my summers working for Northern States Power and Western Electric and other enterprises, and the move towards my area of real interest, which increasingly had become that of what we came to call Black Studies. And in those years, again, there were no Black Studies developments. Black Studies movement in many ways was an offshoot of the Black Power movement. And again, one of the major outcomes of the Morrill Hall takeover was, again, the creation of the Department of African American and African Studies, that and the Martin Luther King Jr. Counseling and Advising Program, which I was privileged to lead for a couple of years in the early 1970s. But as a graduate student, my turn towards the studies of the African diaspora and African American history and culture and literature and so forth would become my professional focus. And I ultimately left the university as a graduate student after I had completed my coursework and PhD prelims, and took my first professional teaching job at Carleton College back in 1973, where Black students had protested against Carleton College's lack of Black Studies courses and materials and majors. I had been asked to come to Carleton to develop a major in Afro-American and African Studies. And again, in that context, I began teaching courses across the disciplinary spectrum in African American literature, film, history, cultural movements like the Harlem Renaissance, the Black Arts movement itself, and African literature and culture and so on. Those interests stayed with me because after 10 years at Carleton, I was persuaded to return to the university, which I did in the early 1980s, 1983 or 1984. And I became ultimately the chair of the department. During my years at Carleton, I had spent a good deal of time going to research centers elsewhere in the country at historically Black colleges and universities like Howard in Washington, D.C., like at AU in Atlanta, the AU complex in Atlanta, to the Amistad collection in New Orleans, to the Schomburg Center in New York, where you had these large archives of Afro-Americana and Africana. And so my immersion in those kinds of repositories of African-American cultural and historical materials had a tremendous impact on me. And when I came back to the university, I determined as one of our goals as a department, and my personal goals, was try to create an archive of African Americana at the University of Minnesota, because no such thing existed here. And it was in that context that ultimately we were able to acquire the Archie Givens Senior Collection. There's a lot of backstory to that. We'll see if we have time to come back to it. But a young Black woman, student of mine, in one of my African American literature survey courses, a student whom I'd helped get a job working in rare books and special collections there, a young Black woman named Amy Russell, was there one day when a catalog came into special collections at the university's archives of African American literature, over 3,000 volumes and a wide array of material that had what was the property of a New York-based white collector named Richard Lee Hoffman. And this archive was up for acquisition. And Ms. Russell contacted me, said, Professor Wright, you need to come over here and take a look at this catalog because they're about to put it away on a shelf. And that was indeed the case because there was no organized entity on the campus, university campus then, dedicated to trying to create or develop an African-American archive. As soon as I saw the catalog, I realized that this was a prime chance for the University of Minnesota to acquire a collection of first edition works by and about African Americans. It was especially strong in the era of what's come to be called the Harlem Renaissance, but which went all the way back to the very first published work by an African American author, Phyllis Wheatley's 1773 volume, Poems on Various Subjects, Religious and Moral. And it included, besides the works of African American authors, the slave narrative authors of the 19th century, Frederick Douglass and so many others, but also works scattered across the African diaspora. Through I ultimately went to the then president, first of all, to the dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Fred Lukerman at the time, and told him that we had a rare opportunity that we ought not let pass, that we needed to speak with the then president of the university, Ken Keller, to see what might be done to acquire this collection for our university as a building block for an archive. That ended up being a very successful process, and we formed a partnership with the Archie Givens Senior family and its foundation that was already in existence, but which was serving largely the K-12 schools in the Twin Cities area. And with the leadership of the Givens family, of Archie Jr. and Roxanne Givens and Phoebe Givens, and with dedicated African-American alums on campus, who included Claudia Wallace Gardner and Ezell Jones, again, a very, very dedicated former Gopher and NFL football player and business leader and entrepreneur, we brought together a collection of local Black community and business execs and supporters who became a patrons council and who each agreed to contribute $10,000 towards the acquisition of this collection, with the Givens family itself contributing $75,000. Ultimately, we were able to convince the president of the university to extend a loan to complete the purchase price for that collection. We acquired this collection, which was originally called the Black Literature Collection, in 1985. We then renamed it in honor of Archie Givens Sr. And that began the process again, in which we tried to make this special collection of African Americana a living collection and a community connected collection that would serve community needs, that would not only service students and faculty researchers at the university, but would service our local communities. And we began a series of elaborate projects that involved teacher training, summer sessions, where we brought teachers from the Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools in to spend time doing intensive study, first on the Harlem Renaissance itself, and to develop a curricula to put into to place in our public schools. We conducted these teacher training seminars for more than a decade and formed partnerships with the Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools. So that would lead ultimately to a number of other kinds of outreach enterprises, one of which was our development of what would become the very first nationally traveling exhibit on the Harlem Renaissance, called The Stronger Soul Within a Finer Frame, portraying African Americans in the Black Renaissance, for which we applied for, in a partnership with the Weissman Museum at the university, we applied for a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We got a $250,000 to mount a traveling exhibit that toured the country for more than 3 years, and used Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes as the two leading images of the Harlem Renaissance. And again, it toured historically Black colleges and universities, settlement houses, museums and gallery spaces before returning home here and developing another life thereafter. That's part of the context for the development of the Givens collection. It's still alive and well. It's also become a training ground for a new generation of African American literary scholars, because we were able to get grant resources. I and Archie Jr. Went to Eddie Phillips, the head of the Phillips Foundation, i.e. Dear Abby, to help fund graduate fellowships for Black graduate students or graduate students specializing in African American literature to work with the collection in its various outreach activities. All those things became part of the ongoing efforts of the Archie Givens Senior Collection over the years. Let me catch your breath. I know I've been going here at breakneck speed and not giving you much of a chance to jump in, but that's the danger of this kind of exchange.
No, this is perfect. One of the things I was talking about just the other day was with other arts educators who made the decision to stay sort of in the arts education bubble because of the freedom that it sort of allows us, that the school districts don't give us, to discuss things, especially around Black history. And it obviously is a hot button subject, not just because of the current affairs, but because of the current state of education in Minnesota. And so a couple people were asking me to make sure that I ask you, in your time teaching in Black studies at the University of Minnesota, did they give you the freedom to, sort of have control over your own curriculum? And if so, like, what was the development of that like? How did that come to be?
One of the things, again, when we originally started the process to create the department, we very explicitly wanted to be just that, a department, which in terms of higher education means autonomy over the development of the curriculum and a stable line item supported tenured or tenurable faculty who determine and shape the curriculum to fit the needs that their professional expertise dictates. And so again, we have, over the course of the decades, defined and redefined the curriculum in African American and African studies. It's always been a diasporic enterprise that has combined focus again on domestic African American culture and history, plus the worlds of the African and New World African diaspora. So we try to give students again a global perspective. We try to expose them to approaches from across the humanities, arts, and social sciences disciplines as much as our resources allow, and we try to ally ourselves with other academic entities on campus who have shared goals and objectives.
Okay. And so I went to Central High School, and one of the conversations that, kind of was an ongoing one, even after I graduated, was the fact that we don't have, Black studies or African American history classes that are considered history credits. And so as we, especially as art educators, as we start to develop curriculum, as the school district is sort of responding to the current state and giving us more freedom to come into the schools and teach our kids, where would you recommend that we start?
Well, one way, of course, is understanding the history of these issues, these debates, because the struggle over the curriculum and over diversifying the curriculum in American education and schools is longstanding. It's been taking place for generations. There's been peaks of intensity that have varied from era to era, but it's not new. I mentioned earlier on the Black student protest on historically Black college and university campuses back in the 1920s and early 30s. Back then, Black students who were being led by Black scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and Alain Locke and Sterling Brown, Black students were then saying that particularly in Black colleges and universities, an Africa-centered, an Afro-American-centered curriculum was essential and needed to be instituted. And some of those protests back then took place precisely over those issues. In some ways, we were revisiting those protest issues in the 1960s and 1970s. So a historical perspective in that respect, I think, would help contemporary students in addressing those things, whether you're confronting things in our high schools, our public school systems there, or in higher education. Another thing is these, at this point in time, young people need to be aware that the public buzz and the current debates over what's called critical race theory, also those debates also have a history. Yep. And too many people parrot those terms around without really understanding what they mean, what their origins are. Critical race theory has its origins primarily in the work of African-American legal scholars and professors, many of whom were part of the civil rights struggle, the legal struggle. Many of them were members of the NAACP legal defense team and so forth, and who saw the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of the mid-1960s come and go, and with limited achievements coming from them in certain sectors of our public life. And leaders such as Derek Bell, who is one of the primary authors of critical race theory, and who was a Harvard lawyer and legal scholar, but also had been an NAACP lawyer himself. The developers of critical race theory a quarter of a century ago were trying to create a scholarly perspective that would begin to explain why the civil rights agenda had failed to achieve a number of its major objectives, particularly in terms of cultural and educational transformation, and to begin to think about what needed to be done to address those failures. That's the origin of critical race theory. Anyone who's really interested in it, the original collection is an anthology called simply Critical Race Theory, published in the late 1990s. Ready access, and you can get a copy of it and look at it and read it. Many of the people who parrot the term out today are doing it in misleading and misrepresentative ways. Yeah. But that's one of the part of the current battleground, both in higher education and particularly in the public schools now, because in a kind of a strange twist of history, a terminology and a theoretical framework that emerged out of higher education has now filtered down to the K-12 system, and to oftentimes to opponents who don't really understand what they're battling, or if they do understand it, don't want to be explicit about what precisely the source of their resistance is.
And for those of us that have experienced Black history within the schools, I know the conversation has mostly started sort of just around Ado's life at slavery. And do you think that there's a danger in starting the conversation there, and do we have responsibility to expand it?
Yes, there's a danger in starting with slavery. Before African Americans were slaves, we were something of a quite different order. In an old world across the ocean that had its own rich history that we need to understand, a history that in many ways was tragically cut off by the transatlantic slave trade. And part of the challenge, again, of developing a genuine historical consciousness is bridging that gap across the Middle Passage to the cultures of of ancient and medieval and modern Africa, where all of us originate.
Okay.
I began for many years, I began my courses in African American literature, not in the era of the American Revolution or in the colonial era, with the African oral epic tradition in medieval West Africa, in Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, or in East Africa, and in the oral and literate traditions, all right, literate traditions again in Arabic and in other written African scripted languages that carried again those worlds of words and images and imagination that African Americans had to transport with them to the New World under very precarious and problematic circumstances.
I appreciate that, because I think that there's been an agenda behind not just starting the conversation there, but also only describing us in terms like resilient or strong. I think that that's worked against us in the long haul of things. It's almost made us seem inhuman, or it's made us more magical than it's provided us humanity. And I know that there are people in the comments that also have questions here. So I do want to also defer to Carolyn so that we get a chance to answer some of those as well.
Wonderful. I look forward to broadening the exchange.
All right. Oh, those are some beautiful questions, and what a gorgeous conversation we're having tonight. So if everybody wants to just show your faces now, and I'm sure there are a million questions, and you can put them in the chat or you can speak them out. Either is fine. Colnice Hendon, I saw your your message for Dr. Wright. You want to just tell him what that was in case he didn't see it?
My brother, Ira Hendon, wanted me to tell you hello. I told him I was on a Zoom hearing you share the history of U of M, and you were a professor at Carleton when he was there, so he says hello.
Well, hello back to him.
Okay, I'll tell him.
And this was a very rich conversation. I just know people's brains are just rolling around with questions. Excuse me. Okay, Chakra Green, good evening. Good evening, Chakra Green. Glad to have you here. Dr. Wright, how can people visit the Gibbons collection?
The Gibbons collection, as the case with nearly all of the university's archive collections, it's open to the public. You don't have to have a formal university affiliation to visit the special collections on campus. But those collections are housed on the west bank of the university campus in the Anderson Library building. And unfortunately, of course, COVID has restricted access to some extent, but it is still possible to visit there and to have reference librarians give tours of the collection proper and to some of the materials that are on exhibit. So it is open. There's a website, again, for the Gibbons collection as part of the Anderson Library and University Archives and Collections menu that you can visit. We also have a number of online websites that contain materials from the collection, including some of the book jackets and ephemera. One of the strengths of the original collection that had so many first editions of Harlem Renaissance era books was that that era, the 1920s and early 1930s, was an era of lavishly illustrated book jackets and internal illustrations and paintings. So many of the most accomplished Black visual artists of the 1920s, people like Aaron Douglas, for instance, and Charles Johnson, illustrated books by Langston Hughes, by Zora Neale Hurston, by County Cullen, many of the other key writers of the Harlem Renaissance. We have in the Gibbons collection a collection of book jackets from that era that it's hard to replicate any place else in the country. So that's one of the glories of our holdings in the Givens
Mhm.
collection.
One of the many glories of that collection. It's just absolutely amazing. And you
I-
created a touring show around Langston Hughes.
Well, thanks, Carolyn, for mentioning that. I hope we get a chance to talk about that.
Mhm.
Langston Hughes, who was, as I mentioned, was one of our two central icons for the traveling exhibit on the Harlem Renaissance, was, of course, one of our first our first performance poets who performed his works again to musical accompaniment. And we must not forget that about Langston Hughes. Langston Hughes' first volume of poetry was called The Weary Blues.
Yeah.
And, Langston himself talked about, his childhood growing up again in Missouri, Kansas City, elsewhere, so forth, and listening to blues music and blues singers and performers and imbibing the poetry of the blues. He tried to capture that in his work, blues and jazz and gospel and all the rest. So Langston is in that sense a forerunner, one of the grandparents of the world of today's hip hop and rap traditions. One of Langston's late musical enterprises, late poetic and musical enterprises, because he was drawn in the course of his career across the literary genres. Langston was, besides a poet, he was also a novelist and a playwright and a screenwriter and a popular historian and so many other things, but he ultimately saw himself finally first and foremost as a poet. One of his last major poetic efforts was inspired by the young people of the 1960s,
Hmm.
and a volume called Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz,
Okay.
which had been created. Langston served, again, he knew so many musicians personally and intimately, so many our classic musicians personally and intimately, and he served as the MC for the Newport Jazz Festival of 1960, which had a huge gallery of major African American musicians across the musical spectrum. And that particular year, um, the clamor for tickets to the Newport Jazz Festival was such that they ran out of tickets, and a furor went through a crowd. The newspapers, in the aftermath, would call it a jazz-starved, jazz-mad crowd who couldn't get tickets to the Newport Jazz Festival that year to hear all these blues and gospel and jazz, blues, jazz, and gospel performers.
Yeah.
And they rioted. And the National Guard had to be called out, and they shut down the Newport Jazz Festival that year.
Mhm.
And Langston had to preside over the closing of the Newport Jazz Festival.
Wow.
And as he did so that year and ruminated on the circumstances, his mind spread out, because Langston was also a world traveler. He was multilingual, translated works from French and from Spanish and so forth in the course of his career, had traveled the African diaspora, and was very much aware of the independence movements that had led to newly independent countries in Africa and in the Caribbean and so forth. And so he decided to create a praise poem, extended praise poem to the freedom struggle that would be articulated in both poetic and musical terms, and that would draw on musical traditions, not just Afro-American jazz and gospel and blues, but ensemble music from Brazil, from Caribbean, Jamaican, what's now become reggae music traditions and calypso and so forth, from a variety of African oral and musical traditions, all into this praise poem that would be framed by the vernacular street corner rhetoric of the Dirty Dozens. The title Ask Your Mama comes from the Dirty Dozens. It's part of verbal dueling, street corner verbal dueling. Part of the ways in which outside of the school systems, young Black folks have trained themselves in the nuances, the rhythms, the images of language, and also in the politics of our social and cultural predicament, all right, that leads us into the vernacular of the obscene and the profane, all right, which is where in part Ask Your Mama takes us. So he created a suite of 12 jazz poems. His original intent was to have the great jazz bassist Charlie Mingus accompany him. Langston and Charlie Mingus had joined forces earlier in an album of recorded poetry, with Mingus composing the music to accompany Langston's words. But this is the mid-1960s. Charlie Mingus's health was failing. That collaboration ultimately didn't take place. Langston talked then with Randy Weston, another pivotal jazz figure and musicians, about collaborating on this, but ultimately they were never able to get together to perform Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz on stage. One of the things that we acquired in the Givens collection was a typescript of Langston's original drafts for Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz, with all of his musical notations to it. And so I said, let's make it live.
Let's make it live.
And part of what had happened was a member of our department faculty, my very close friend and colleague, Reginald Buckner, who was head of the Jazz Studies program at the university, had unfortunately died much too young. He was one of the most sweet-souled human beings I have ever known, and a creative genius on the piano. Reggie had died, and a memorial service was held for Reggie at the Ferguson School of Music. And so I got the bright idea of getting some of my friends in the local jazz and musical world. Frank Wharton, who taught music at St. Paul Central for many, many years and was an accomplished multi-instrument performer in his own right. And Soa Mensah, a Ghanaian drummer and percussionist who had taught courses for us at the university and at McAllister and elsewhere. I got them together and we performed two of the moods of Langston Hughes's Ask Your Mama as part of Reggie Buckner's memorial at the School of Music back then. This is 1989 and 1990. It was so well received that people began asking, well, are you going to do it again or do the whole enterprise? So Frank and I and so on then began talking about trying to put together a troupe to perform it then in the Warehouse District at a place that's now long gone called Ruby's Cabaret, which was again a jazz joint in the Warehouse District back then. That ultimately didn't happen, but what did happen was that a new Weissman Museum, art museum, was built on campus, and an opening was scheduled for it in 1990. And the head of the Weissman Museum, Lyndall King, and her associate director Colleen Sheehy, asked me if we could put together the entire suite of Langston Hughes's Ask Your Mama as part of the opening celebrations for the Weissman Museum. I agreed to do so. We got the university's faculty jazz quartet together, and I decided that a third dimension besides music and poetry was important. Langston Hughes was also devoted to the visual arts, the painting and film and sculpture and all the rest, and visual images recur throughout his work. So I decided to create a third visual dimension that would capture that aspect of Langston's experience and the world of the Ask Your Mama suite of jazz programs, which traveled globally and had scenes again from all over the African diaspora. So I put together a set of synchronized slides. This is before computer graphic technology had matured. a set of synchronized slides to accompany the music and the words. I was the spoken words artist, and the faculty jazz quartet became the musicians. We had this third dimension. We performed the suite for the opening of the Weissman Museum. That got further attention, and when began to be asked about whether or not this could be performed elsewhere, it started the process whereby we spent the next decade traveling the country performing Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz,
Wow.
as under the title the Langston Hughes Project. And again, we covered the country, and you know, an amazing array of places. And probably our pinnacle achievement was collaborating with the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band in New York City at famed Carnegie Hall. In this case, I had to leave our musicians behind because Carnegie Hall had its own jazz band, of course. John Faddis, the famed trumpeter, was leading the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band in its what was its final season. So we performed Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz at Carnegie Hall in 2000, the fall of 2000, on a program devoted to the Harlem Renaissance. And so the half of the program was devoted to, again, me as spoken word artist leading the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band. And the other parts were performed by the famous Black cabaret singer Bobby Short, Black opera singers, dancers, and so forth were all on the Carnegie Hall stage for that performance back in 2000. So you ask a simple question, and you get a long and perhaps convoluted response.
And really amazing response. There are 2 hands up for questions. And there's also, I just wanted to let you know that there are folks here from Utah, from Massachusetts, from Connecticut.
Utah, my goodness.
Yeah, can you believe it? And Tampa, Florida. And they want to know if there's a way to do a virtual tour of the Givens collection. And then you can respond if the folks who have their hands up can ask their questions.
Okay, I would love to have a virtual tour of the Givens collection. That's not currently available, but there are, again, some digitized materials up online. And one of the things that grew out of the Givens collection was our most recent curator, who unfortunately for us has moved on to become the head of special collections at the Minnesota History Center, Cecily Marcus. Created a wonderful, vast website called Umbra, which is a repository of African-American materials, again, across the disciplines and across the eras. And access to that is available off of the website for the Givens collection on the university, the library web.
Okay, thank you. Lamont? Your hand's up. You have a question.
Thank you so much to the organizers for putting us together in this conversation. I am from Atlanta, and I was wondering, Dr. Wright, if you could talk a little bit about your experience as a student organizer addressing any conflicts amongst your comrades of the day.
All right, that's an important question.
Sure
Oftentimes not fully addressed. Again, during those student years, again, were years of tumult, and not just on the streets, in our discussion groups and meeting rooms and protest sessions. There are a wide array of different political perspectives, historical outlooks, strategic agendas at work that had to be negotiated, that had to be articulated and negotiated. Again, that era, again, in the mid-1960s, there were a profusion of African-American organizations that arose and moved center stage during the period. So besides the civil rights groups that we associate there, again, Dr. King's and Ralph Abernathy's SCLC, student groups like SNCC, groups like the Nation of Islam, the Black Panthers, the Republic of New Africa, the list goes on and on and on. And they were all articulating different approaches to the common problem of achieving Black liberation and human liberation and full freedom. And that widespread, that spectrum of positions, again, we were constantly battling over. So, one of the things that powerfully influenced us during the period, for instance, and this is just to be thinking about the impact of voices from abroad, the impact of the works, for instance, of the West Indian psychiatrist and political activist and revolutionary Frantz Fanon. Fanon's works, The Wretched of the Earth, in particular, in Black Skins, White Mass, became standard reading for us, as were the works of Amilcar Cabral and of West Indian writers and thinkers, the negritude writers and poets from the Francophone world of Leopold Senghor and Aimé Césaire and so on, were all part of our orbit. And debating their different approaches to the issues of Black freedom and so forth were critical. The Marxist, the influence of Marxist Leninist thought was critical. And of course, we identify that in part with the Panthers, but those ideological differences also had to be worked out, had to be negotiated. And that was part of what was exciting about what was going on in our student groups. There was also a good deal of religious diversity there, some of which we don't oftentimes mention. One of the things in terms of my own early childhood development was getting a sense of religious diversity within the African-American community. I'm trying to understand that not all Black folks are Baptists and Methodists.
Yeah.
Although my grandparents my grandfather belonged to one of the oldest members of Bethesda Baptist Church. My grandmother was a member of St. Peter's AME. All of us, we were all baptized at St. Peter's and so forth. But my grandparents had what they referred to as a mixed marriage across denominational lines. But we knew, again, our family, we had ties with Black folks of other religious orientations. We had friends who indeed were Muslim and Baha'i. In fact, the Baha'i local Black community had a significant impact. In fact, there was a Baha'i family lived in the same apartment building that we did, my grandparents' apartment building, the Curtis Ewing family, which were leaders in the local Black Baha'i community. So, I was exposed early on to those different kind of religious perspectives as well, to help broaden my sense of spiritual outlooks and possibilities.
Okay, thank you.
Have I part answered your question?
Maybe you did. He's
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes, you did it, especially at the very end, speaking about your own sort of spiritual engagement, right? Because of course, doing organizing work for young people in general, can be hard. And, conflicts between people who might really love each other come up, and we often have to figure out ways to address them.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
Well, we had another very young voice come in there. No, you're absolutely right. And there's no way around dialogue on those kinds of issues. You're trying to seek whatever common ground you can, given the differences of religious framework or political perspective, so on. That again has been part both of the challenge and the strength of our freedom movement over these many, many generations. We sometimes forget that for a long time, the leadership of African Americans, of Black Americans of descent from outside of the U.S. has been part of our national history as well. Black folks from the Caribbean have had an outside role as leaders of Black organizations in this country from the 18th century onward. So it ought not be a surprise to us to understand that. And one of the big impacts, again, of an era like the Harlem Renaissance was that we had a diversity of voices entering into our dialogues, both in the world of politics and the arts, coming from outside of this country. The Garvey movement is one of the most visible such examples of that. Garvey is a Jamaican immigrant who came to this country in part to seek answers to to problems of Black autonomy and power in the Caribbean. He's Jamaican born, but Jamaica was still a British colony during those years. He came to this country to seek an alliance with Booker T. Washington, who was, again, a slave-born African-American leader here. Garvey and Washington didn't meet because Washington died before Garvey could, but Garvey built a nationalist movement that in which West Indian presence was central, although it drew again across the spectrum of Black folks from around the diaspora. That would be replicated in the 1960s and organizations as well, where we'd have Black folks, again, from the Caribbean, from West and Southern Africa and so forth, who would move into leadership roles and articulate alternative cultural and religious and political perspectives that helped enrich our sense of possibility. At the same time, of course, that it increased the areas of potential friction and conflict.
Okay, thank you. There was another hand. They put their hand down. Did you want to ask your question? Okay, well, Dr. John Wright, we have a final request for you.
Uh-oh. Please let me have it.
Now that we know you're a spoken word artist too, let it rip. Let's have it.
Oh my goodness.
You see them hands going up, everybody saying, yeah, we want to hear it.
Oh my goodness. Well, yeah, it used to be that, I mean, the Langston Hughes Ask Your Mama 12 Moods for Jazz is 800 lines long. I used to know most of it by heart. Do you remember some of it by heart? But it's been more than a decade since I have done it in public. But it begins with the repeated, which becomes a refrain. All right. In the quarter of the Negroes, where the doors are doors of paper, dust of dingy atoms beats a clearly sound. And that refrain, in the quarter of the Negroes, becomes a refrain that Langston carries through section after section after section. And they know say, dust of dingy atoms is another recurring refrain line. Dust of dingy atom. That's a what do you call it? Twisted, but a oblique way of talking about dark brown, black skin. Dust of dingy atoms. Oh, at any rate, but yes, it all takes place in the context in the quarter of the Negro, and the quarter of the Negroes moves across this country to the Caribbean, to Africa, to Europe, and so on. It part follows Langston's travels over the course of the year. So the quarters of the Negro is not one single place, but it's a kind of an image or a metaphor for wherever it is that we live or have lived.
You and this community got to bring it back. I am not kidding. Got to bring it back. The Ordway's waiting for you.
Oh my goodness.
And so am I.
Well, I'm very, very glad that we've been able to have this exchange. And you say we're at an end here?
Yeah, I think we're kind of coming close to the end. Do you have any final thoughts that you want to share before we?
Well, I know that I've gone on at some length in responding to some of first Brittany's questions and then some of the folks who have joined us. Again, I want to really thank you for taking time away from your late afternoon or evening to spend on this exchange. And I hope that you will continue to support this enterprise, again, embracing our roots and Black Table Talk and so forth. And to Carolyn and Raquette and to Brittany and all those who are engaged in this enterprise, I want to charge you with keeping the faith here. And that means the faith of spirit, of creative imagination, and of political commitment going forward, because as I continue to say again and again, the struggle for freedom is transformational. generational.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much. And we would like for y'all, if you are willing, there is an evaluation form. It's on a Google form in the chat. Oops, where did it go? It disappeared. And it did not disappear. Nia, could you put it, where is it?
It just
It's
moved
very-
up.
Hmm?
There it is.
Okay. Okay, where is it? Okay. Okay, if you could fill this out, everyone, we would really appreciate it. It's a Google form, so you just, answer those few questions and hit submit. We would very much appreciate it. And you can also leave your email address, especially those from other communities who might like to stay in touch with the three organizations that are responsible for embracing our roots. And I believe Raquette CSR is going to, has a few comments, and then we're going to say goodnight.
Thank you, Carolyn. And Brittany, it's an honor to have you join us as the new director for Black Table Arts. And you definitely hit the ground running by
Yes.
joining us with this
I don't
particular-
see the forms.
You don't see the
Oh.
prompt?
Oh, it's in the chat. What we'll do is have Nia continue to just put it, because I think as people comment, it moves up.
Okay,
But if I'm gonna just once again just thank Brittany for being such an awesome conversationalist, and Dr. Wright, words cannot express the amount of gems and jewels, and just, I mean, somebody put in there that the knowledge and the information you were sharing was just pure gold. It's more than gold. We appreciate you for all the years that you've committed to the university and have been there as a pillar to help make sure that Black students like me, who came in 1992 and saw this beautiful man, articulate man who was really clear about history and culture and literacy, representing us. It gave us perspective. And so I think that is being shared with our community. We thank you, all of the participants today, from wherever you came from. I mean, people from Utah, Florida, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Virginia, Ohio, Atlanta, Oklahoma City, North Carolina, and of course, Minnesota. We thank all of you, and do encourage you to share your contact information and keep in touch. This is not our last series. Actually, the next one we will have is Sister Mary Moore Esther.
Mary Moore Easter.
Mary Moore Easter, an old friend and colleague of mine.
Mhm. She will be in
Mary Moore Easter, who, I'm sorry.
She'll be in conversation with Genesia Williams, who is here tonight. So if Genesia, if you want to just say a couple of words about what you and Mary are going to do next month, that'll be awesome. It'll be on March 17th, same time.
Yes.
Bad time, same back channel.
Mhm.
I did not prepare any remarks for this, but
I did not know. I'm sorry. I hit you on the spot there.
we will be having a similar conversation, and I'm so grateful for this conversation tonight and the way that Brittany led the conversation, and where John Wright was like this conversation was like my kind of conversation, because my brain works in a similar way. And so I'm really grateful to have been here and to hear this. And we're going to endeavor to have as interesting of a conversation, but I don't know what we're going to talk about just yet. We're still prepping.
But you do know that Mary Moore Easter, she is a poet. She has published 4
Yes,
books.
she is.
She's
Yes,
working on a
yes,
memoir
she
right
has.
now. And she started the dance program at Carleton College.
Yes, she did.
Dr. Wright used to teach. So there was,
Yes.
and as a Black woman, starting a full dance program, and
Yes.
that little white college down the road is pretty awesome. And
It
she,
is.
so you're going to be talking about a lot of stuff.
Thank you. Thank you
like
for the
me and John
assist.
were.
Thank you so much for the assist.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Raquette.
No, you did what you're supposed to do. So thank you all. Thank you for filling out the evaluation forms. And once again, Dr. Wright, thank you.
Well,
and
thank-
come back any and all times.
Well, thank
Thank
you
you,
so,
Carolyn.
so very, very much. And Brittany,
Yeah.
thank you for bearing with me along the way. I know that I may have gone off the rails from time to time, but you were on point.
She
You
was.
were
Ooh, her questions were just beautiful and just, woo. Mm,
amazing.
mhm.
Nice. So for information about these organizations, the Facebook and social media links were posted in the chat, as well as our websites. Visit, like, show us some love so that we can keep doing what we're doing. We
Mhm.
appreciate your being here. And thank you. Have a great evening.
Thank you, everyone, from all over wherever you came from, including Minnesota.